Hi there, everyone. My name is Christian Eschbach, and welcome to a rap party for Van Halen. I had asked my regular viewers whether or not I should do a rap party for the different sections of Van Halen or Van Halen as a whole. Van Halen as a whole was the response I got, so Van Halen as a whole is how I am going to do this rap party. Alright, that being said, I've decided to put this rap party into three different categories. First off, my personal listening orders for the album based on how often I'm going to listen to them versus how often I'm not going to listen to them. Not a best of, not what I even think is the best albums, just how often I will listen to an album versus how often I will not listen to an album. Okay, I'll get to that. Second part is going to be discussing how I would fix the David Lee Roth era. Because if you're one of my regular viewers, you know that I am... It's not a matter of Van Roth versus Van Hagar. It's a matter of I like Sammy Hagar's voice better than I like David Lee Roth's voice. Okay, so that's what that comes down for me. But on the whole, when you look at the number of albums that Van Roth released versus the number of albums that Van Hagar released, there could have been a lot, the albums could have been a lot better on the Van Roth side, and I will explain how. And then the third part I'm going to talk about, when it does come down to, and this is where I'm going to do the Van Roth versus Van Hagar thing, okay? So when it comes down to Van Roth versus Van Hagar, everybody always argues whether or not, which side was more commercial, which side was more pop, which side sold more albums. So using those measurements, I'm going to discuss theoretically how the argument really should go. Not how it is, not where it works with my preferences, and I'm not going to try and convince you that the Sammy Hagar era was better. That is not the point of part 3. Part 3 is to discuss the particular arguments over album sales, over commercialism, and over pop. Alright. So, I'm going to do this in sections. Let's get to the next section. Okay, section 1. My preferences for how I listen to Van Halen. Now, I'm going to do this backwards. So, I'm going to do the album I will listen to the least, going to the album I will listen to the most. Alright, album I will listen to the least. And I'm sure this is not going to surprise anybody. Van Halen 3. That album is just a mess, and I will probably very rarely throw it in my CD player now that I've reviewed it. I really do not expect it to get any play. Next up after that, if you're one of my regular viewers, you should already know, and you might have even guessed if you're one of my regular viewers, that this might have been on the bottom of the list, forgetting that there was a Van Halen 3. And that is Diver Down. Oh my lord, okay. First Van Halen album I ever bought almost was the last Van Halen album I ever bought. Not the album you should start your Van Halen collection on. After that, we go into OU812. Coming hot off the heels of 5150, OU812. Just no. No, did not work. And out of the albums from the Van Hagar era, that's really the biggest disappointment as far as I'm concerned. After that, we go into Fair Warning. Fair Warning really should be higher up this list, but like I discussed when I did the review for it, it's got a weird production to it where they really sound like they were trying to make Van Halen sound metal for some weird reason. And when I say metal, I'm not talking metal. I'm talking like the Sunset Strip kind of metal, the hair metal. That's, for some weird reason, they were trying to give that sound. Because there's definitely like not, I say Motley Crue for the metal comparison of that time period because Motley was one of the few hair metal bands that were actually fully up and running at that time. But that is the comparison I want to go with, you know? And that isn't Van Halen, and I think that's what hurts Fair Warning as an album. After that, we get into Van Halen 2. I just, it's not a bad album. It's just, to me, it's got a lot of fluff and filler on it, which I'm just not really that interested in listening to. 1984 is after that. Now people are gonna be like, really, 1984? I like I like 1984. I would deem 1984 as definitely one of Van Halen's top 5 albums, possibly top 3. Not number 1, but definitely it could be into the top 3, 100% in the top 5. The reason why for me 84 is so low is the more commercial songs that are on the album. I love Hot for Teacher because of the drum intro. The song itself is kind of fun. I'm never going to say no and turn it off. It's a good tune. I'm never going to say no and turn off Panama. Jump, on the other hand, that comes on the radio. I flip to another station right away, man. I don't want to listen to Jump. And that alone is enough for me to kind of knock this down the list, just because I don't want to hear Jump anymore. Also, Jump is, to this day, and because of Eddie's passing, well, their only number 1 single, and I'm going to come back to that afterwards. All right. After 84, we are on to Balance. And this puts us in about the middle of the pack now, and a few of these are kind of interchangeable as far as I'm concerned. Balance is not a bad album, but it is a post-grunge album, so it was affected like most post-grunge albums were. However, I like Balance. I've been a big fan of Balance ever since it first came out. I know a lot of people that weren't. It just really, I dug on it, man. It was an album for its time. That is the downside to that album. It is an album from its time, so I have to be feeling a little nostalgic to put on Balance. All right, Women and Children First. This is one of those albums that was pretty decent. I honestly enjoyed this album, but it's another one that has a few too many fillers for me to really enjoy the album as much as I could. Then we get into For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge. For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, actually, when I first put this list together, For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge and 1984 were like 100% interchangeable when I was putting this. Either one could have been either spot. And I ended up moving For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge up the list because there are more album cuts on this track, on the track listing, that I do enjoy as opposed to 1984. But they both suffer from the exact same thing. There's one song on the album I am so tired of hearing, I don't want to listen to the album. In this case, though, I'm more prone, just so I can enjoy the rest of the album, to get up and hit skip. And that is the song Right Now. I covered this one. Pepsi. Oh. Pepsi getting the rights to this one kind of hurt this song. Otherwise, I think it would have been a better song and it would have been more loved. And it would have been a higher single if it had not been for the Pepsi commercials. All right, next one. We're into the last 3. And these last 3, if you're a Van Halen fan, you're already kind of going, really? Wait, hold on a second. What is going on here? If you are not a Van Halen fan, or not a huge Van Halen fan, like if you don't own all the albums and you're just watching this because you want to get a sense of what you should do with Van Halen, the next album is really going to surprise a few people, and that is A Different Kind of Truth. That's right. The last album recorded with David Lee Roth. I absolutely fell in love with this album. When I did the review, I feel I kind of downplayed the album a little bit, but the album itself is a fantastic album that really feels beyond a date period. Like, it doesn't feel like a 2010s album. It doesn't feel like a 2000 album. It doesn't feel like a nostalgic 1980s album. It doesn't feel like something that came out of, the pre-grunge era or the post-grunge era. It just sounds like a really good timeless kind of album that has elements from all over the decades. That it's great. And the way that it's all put together is just the only complaint on the album is the fact that Michael Anthony's not on it. And Wolfgang is, and Wolfgang does a great job, so I'm not going to complain. All right. Then we get into 5150. I'm a Sammy Hagar fan, folks. I made that very clear at the beginning, so you knew that a Sammy album was going to be up here. 5150, the first album featuring Sammy Hagar. It was a fantastic album, but it has to be the runner-up to my all-time favorite Van Halen album. I still think it is, and all the stuff I said at the beginning you have to ignore, because I do think this is by far Van Halen's greatest album, and that is Van Halen, the first album, man. It is the only album I will play 100% beginning to end. Even as much as I like to mock Ice Cream Man, I don't skip it, man. This album is brilliant from point A to point B, man. You just, hell no, man. I love having this album on CD. That way I don't even have to get up and skip it or flip around. I just get pure excellence from beginning to end. I will overplay the hell out of this album to the day I die. It is one of those albums that is just magnificent. It's really super close to a perfect 10 as far as I'm concerned. I mean, like, Ice Cream Man is the only thing that stops me from going, it's a perfect 10. But even then, man, I'm on that. I'll campaign for it. That's how much I love this album. So that's my list, folks. Number 3, Diver Down, OU812, Fair Warning. Number 2, 1984, Balance, Women and Children First, For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, A Different Kind of Truth, 5150, and then Van Halen. All right, let's move on to part 2. My biggest complaint and my biggest issue with the David Lee Roth era comes down in a good part to how record labels functioned at the time. And the idea was, especially with new bands, to pump out as many new albums as possible while the band was still hot, was still firing on all cylinders. Just get it out there, get it out there, get it out there. Some bands, it works for. Each album either gets better or is consistently great. You know, Metallica had Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets. We know why that got busted. But those 3 albums, boom, 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 fantastic albums. Alice Cooper, you've got Love It to Death, Killer, School's Out, $1 Billion Babies. Boom, 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 boom. Fantastic albums, you know. Muscle of Love was a slight falter. Some people blame that on the change in production. I personally think it was a fantastic album still. And then you're still going, and you got Welcome to My Nightmare next, and it's like boom, 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 boom. And the only gap was between Muscle of Love and Welcome to My Nightmare. There was about a year gap in there. Other bands that have done it as well. Van Halen, on the other hand, the great songs on every album, but the boom, 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 boom honestly started to hurt them. With the biggest gap being between 1982 and 1983 when the album 1984 was released, and that's because one was kind of towards the earlier part, one was kind of towards the end part or something. I don't remember exactly, and I'm not going to worry about bringing up those because I'm rambling on too long. So where I'm going with all of this, the way to fix the David Lee Roth era of Van Halen is to cut down on the number of albums released, because the other problem with the David Lee Roth era is very rarely was it maxed out. Usually you got about 10, on average, we'll say about 10 songs on each album, about 5 songs per side, and you usually only hit about 30-ish minutes. In a lot of cases, it felt like, you know, they went for the bare minimum they could to hit an LP, and then they put a couple covers in there as filler. If they removed certain tracks and took out the covers, and you compress it down and released an album every other year instead, they would have worked out better. And let me explain how. Okay, so first off, you've already been watching this. You know I'm not going to alter the first Van Halen album. Perfect album, leave it. Okay, so you got the first Van Halen album. Comes out perfect. Then you get to the next Van Halen album, which in this case, I'm going to call To Women and Children, To Women First. To Women First. You know, that's what we're going to call it. So have a little joke. Now, the first half of this, the way I split this is the first half of the album is songs from Van Halen 1, second half is songs from Women and Children first. I didn't bother to intermix them because the way this works out, it works out well and it's a nice format. And basically, all I would do is side A would be Dance the Night Away, Somebody Get Me a Doctor, Light Up the Sky, Spanish Fly, DOA, Women in Love, and Beautiful Girls. Side B would be And the Cradle Will Rock, Romeo Delight, even though I'm not a huge fan of the vocals. It's not a bad song all the way around. Tora Tora, just for a little bit of the filler because there was a little space on there. Everybody Wants Some, Take Your Whiskey Home, in a simple rhyme. That's the second album to me. And as I said, that is the Two Women first album. Now, we wait a little more time and we put a collection together of. We skipped Diver Down, okay? So Diver Down is going to be its own little thing that I'm going to mention in a moment. What we do is we pull a couple of the prime tracks off of Diver Down. Not everything, but a couple of the prime tracks off Diver Down. We put them into Fair Warning. And the reason why we do this is it fills out Fair Warning a little bit better. Now, the production, I think the production would have to have the Diver Down production instead of the Fair Warning production to make this work proper. And I mix it around a little bit just because of how it fits. So stick with me on this one. What we got is we got Mean Street, then Cathedral, then Hear About It Later, Dirty Movies, Sinner's Swing, Unchained, So This Love, Sunday Afternoon in the Park, One Foot Out the Door, Push Comes to Shove, Little Guitars Intro, and Little Guitars. All of a sudden, magnificently better album, and it's filled out. Then, let's talk Diver Down. This is where I would make a difference. Diver Down would be an EP. I would not release it as a full album. I would release it as an EP to kill time between what I call the Fairer Warning album, which is the last one I just did, and 1984, because 1984 is not worth changing. 1984 should be left as it is. So the Diver Down EP would be Where Have All the Good Times Gone as the big, fun, woohoo song. Then it would go into Intruder and Pretty Woman, Dancing in the Streets, Big Bad Bill is Sweet William Now. I fucking hate that song. Happy Trails, and You're No Good to finish it off. There's an EP, with a bunch of covers on it just to make it fun. That is really how I would have went with the Diver Down experience. And then, like I said, 1984, I'd leave the same. So that's how I would fix the Van Roth period and make it more comparable to the Van Hagar period. All right, on to part 3. All right, in this third part, I'm going to speed this up. This is why I'm actually re-recording this. This is my second take on this. The first time I really went into way too much detail. So this time what I'm going to do is really fast, the sales. With David Lee Roth, they sold approximately 57 million albums. With Sammy Hagar, they sold approximately 27 million albums. Even if you break that down to sales per album, all right, these numbers are not going to be 100% accurate because I don't know how they factored in greatest hits albums into these, which ones were which kind of thing. But if you break it down to sales per album, David Lee Roth era Van Halen has still outsold the Sammy Hagar era, doing approximately 8.14 million copies per album, whereas the Van Hagar era did 6.7 million copies per album. That's an average based off of the numbers I already gave. When you get outside of that, okay, so right away on sales, Van Halen with David Lee Roth commercially was more successful because sales is the commercial viability. So everybody likes to argue that the David Lee Roth or the Sammy Hagar era was more commercial than the David Lee Roth era. The sales alone technically say that is wrong, The only thing that makes the Van Hagar era seem more commercially successful or more commercially viable or more commercial period is the fact that they had the Pepsi commercial with Right Now. That is the only thing that technically makes the Van Hagar era more commercial, okay? Is just that one literal commercial. Otherwise, the sales clearly dictate that the commercial viability of Van Halen was with David Lee Roth. Then we get into the quote unquote pop side. Now, when we get into that, the very first thing we have to understand, the very first thing we have to really focus on here is in the world of music, pop means popular, as in popular music. That's why you have contemporary pop, you have rock pop, you have 80s pop, which is really kind of weird. It has its own unique sound, but yeah, 80 you wouldn't think a decade would have its own unique sound, especially considering it only is the beginning of the 80s. And, well, I say that, this is important here. You would think that Van Halen is not the more popular music in the David Lee Roth era because you had 80s pop and stuff like that. But that isn't the case. Get ready. I'm going to blow your minds on this one. Now, I'm going to play a video alongside me. It's not going to match up perfectly because I recorded this video earlier. I've had to do some cuts and edits to it. Hopefully it'll fit right. This was video I filmed off my screen when I did the original recording. And this video footage shows that if you look at the 1980s, the early 1980s, rock in general was a lot more popular still than most people want to give it credit for. Going from 1978. So if you go from 1978 when Van Halen was busting out, okay, and you go all the way through to 1984, the bands that were popular in that period and doing well in that period, most of them were still rock bands. Yeah, you had some other ones in there that weren't, like there was a little bit of disco in there. There was a little bit of Michael Jackson in there. Interestingly enough, though, Eddie Van Halen, and the one album that was in there in that period was, Thriller. Or no, Thriller? Yeah, is that the one that Eat It was on? Whatever album Eat It was on. That particular... Not Eat It. Sorry, that was Weird Al Yankovic. You can tell where I'd rather be with that song. Beat It, sorry. Eddie Van Halen played the solo on there. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is rock, pretty damn popular still in that time. Van Halen, really popular in that time. Now, when you get into the Sammy Hagar period, though, the music scape in general changes drastically. Because, yeah, there was some disco that Van Halen had to go up against, and there was some other soundtracks. Flashdance was a big soundtrack in that time period, stuff like that. So, there was some other stuff in there, a little bit of country, just a little bit. Kenny Rogers just squeaks in there barely, okay? The reason why I bring that up, though, is when you get in the Sammy Hagar period, Garth Brooks, major contender in there. Nirvana, not as big, and all these things that are coming up on the screen, these are the number one albums for the year, okay? So, the most popular album of the year, and you'll notice, yes, every last one, except for Balance, of the, actually, I think Balance even hit too, sorry. Every last one of the Van Hagar albums actually got into a number one position on the charts. I think except for Balance. Balance was the only one that did. But, and if you see it on the screen. Alright, but the Van Roth era, none of the albums hit number one on the charts. They got their only number one single, though. The only number one Billboard single was Jump in the Van Halen era. So if you go by all that, if you go by, what songs got on there, you'd think that Van Hagar would definitely be the more popular band. But if you look at all the other music, as I was stating, Garth Brooks, for example, multiple albums out in that time period, sometimes multiple albums in the same year. Rap albums hip hop albums were all of a sudden a thing. Grunge became a thing in that time period. So, a lot of rock and hard rock and that in the billboards was not popular. Like if you look at, some of it, yes, there were a couple years in there, 1991 was a huge rock year, man. Huge rock metal year in general. The year that Pantera hit #1 on the Billboard charts with Far Beyond Driven, they were like one of the only hard rock bands to hit the charts that year. Only, it was crazy. So overall, in the time period, technically you could argue that Van Hagar was more popular as they scored more singles in the charts. But they were not part of the more popular music at the time. Technically, most of the Van Hagar period, hip hop and rap had really started to become the more dominant and more popular music. Or, you got a lot of alternative bands or stuff like that that started coming out that were just really kind of sucking up the air and taking it away from the bands. So, when it comes to pop, gotta give the points at the end of the day to Van Roth being more pop. Chart-wise, definitely Van Hagar. Van Hagar was more popular charting-wise. But Van Roth was the more popular music when that music was coming out. People just confuse the addition of so much synths into the Van Hagar era as making it more pop, but it wasn't. Still a rock band the whole way through. All right, that's the end of this segment. That's the end of that rant. You may agree with me. You may not agree with me. That's what the comment section is for. Let's get into the closing. I am not and was not here to compare David Lee Roth to Sammy Hagar and their eras of Van Halen. We all know they're going to beat Gary Cherone. That's all that matters, right? Okay, exactly. My point. So, and if you're one of those weirdos, those Gary Cherone weirdos, let me tell you, folks, you're going to the extreme. Okay. Perfect way to wrap it up. Got the David Lee Roth campiness there. Oh, Sammy Hagar, good looks. All right, I'm done, folks. I am so done with this. That's it. I'm done with Van Halen in general. The wrap party is finished. It is over. Leave me your comments. Let me know what you think. I do thank you very much for watching. On your way down to the comments, you are going to see a link that will take you to Patreon. If you feel free to click on that, that'll take you over some special stuff I always got going over on Patreon, sort of. All right. You can just throw me money that way, too. There is a like button, a subscribe button, a bell for notifications. If you are on Rumble, there is a join and a follow button. Please click those buttons. They help me out. They help you out. They help everybody out. You will also find, possibly at some point, this might be on Locals. Peace. Love. Take care.